Chapter 11. Climbing the Ladder. Despite any appearances to the contrary, Scientology as an organization was never run the way conventional groups operate. L. Ron Hubbard did things his way, and the organization that formed around him reflected that. For most of 1980 and 1981, Hubbard was writing books in seclusion with only two aides to assist him, Pat Broker and his wife Annie. She was a long-time messenger. Her tenure went back to the days on the Apollo. Hubbard's absence was referred to as being off the lines, meaning he was not regularly on the normal channels of communication. Essentially, he was allowing the messengers that he had trained over the years to run Scientology internationally. He spent the next 20 months living in his Greyhound bus-sized motorhome, assisted by the brokers, and writing his last novels. During this period, Pat Broker occasionally met with the head of the messengers, a young woman named Dee Dee Vogading. The meetings usually took place at night, at predetermined locations, most often in the Los Angeles area. To ensure Dee Dee's safety, David or another man would drive her to the meeting location. Pat and David were old friends from David's early days at the La Quinta base, and they renewed the friendship during these encounters. Shortly after David began accompanying Dee Dee to these meetings, Hubbard removed her from her post as head of the CMO. Although she could not say for sure, Dee Dee told author Janet Reitman, when interviewed for Janet's book, that she believed Hubbard had been fed false information about her. Dee Dee was replaced as the head of the CMO by her sister, Gail Irwin. Concurrent with Dee Dee's removal, David moved into a post called Special Project Operator, or Special PJT Ops, which was mainly concerned with defending Hubbard against the litany of legal actions being filed against him by various agencies. The most notable stemmed from the FBI raid of the Los Angeles church headquarters in 1977 that revealed massive infiltration of the government by Scientology operatives. Upon assuming the duties of Special PJT Ops, David began reporting to Hubbard himself through Pat Broker. David was now autonomous from the CMO, answering only to Hubbard. I think back to that day when David told me he wanted to go help L. Ron Hubbard, and clearly my son was realizing his ambition. After this promotion, I have been told, his attitude became brasher and less respectful of those with whom he worked. His firecracker personality had fewer and fewer checks and balances. A mean streak appeared, as did a bossy attitude. I can speculate that the more power he got, the more he wanted. His assumption of the Special PJT Ops position opened the door for David to get rid of another potential rival, Hubbard's wife Mary Sue. She took the fall for Hubbard after the 1977 FBI raid and eventually ended up going to jail to protect him, as did 10 others, all convicted of conspiring to steal documents from the U.S. government. Hubbard had said that Mary Sue should leave her post as head of the church's Guardian's Office, its legal and public relations arm, to concentrate on her legal case. Before Dee Dee was removed from her job, she and David had argued about how Mary Sue's stepping down should be handled. David wanted her made an example of, in an effort to further distance Hubbard from the fallout of the raid, while Dee Dee wanted to protect Mary Sue as much as possible and let her slip quietly away from the limelight. With Dee Dee's removal, David's means of dealing with Mary Sue won out, and he had her ostracized and later purged from many Scientology records. No easy task, since she had been Hubbard's staunchest confidant as well as his wife from the early days of Dianetics and Scientology. No one had supported Hubbard through the years more than Mary Sue. Hubbard often prefaced his lectures with casual remarks about goings-on around the organization at St. Hill or in Scientology in general, and he often mentioned Mary Sue's name. These mentions have since been edited out of Hubbard's lectures. Every church in the world maintains a public showpiece referred to as an L. Ron Hubbard office. These are there to maintain Hubbard's presence symbolically as the source of Scientology. On his desk were always photographs of his wife and children. These have been removed as part of purging Mary Sue from the records. When she died in 2002, any mention of her passing became conspicuous by its absence. The usual practice when a Sea Org member dies is for the Executive Director International to issue an in memoriam, which informs Scientologists of the death, detailing the deceased's contributions and thanking them for their good work. The order to ignore that protocol in Mary Sue's case could have come only from David. How much her being banished from the Scientology she did so much to help create contributed to her relatively early demise at age 71, I cannot say, but I personally think it could have been a factor. In late 1981, Hubbard resumed regular communications with the organization, and he asked for reports to be sent to him summarizing every aspect of Scientology operations, from legal situations to how organizations around the world were faring, to matters at the local facility in Gilman Hot Springs. As the head of the CMO, Gail Irwin had overall responsibility and authority for sending the reports to Hubbard. She also had the entire Scientology network to command, so when there were meetings with Pat Broker in which she had to deliver reports and other administrative items for Hubbard and receive his responses to earlier reports, on a few occasions she let David meet with Pat alone. These meetings were often time-consuming affairs. For security purposes, Gail first had to go to a public phone booth at a pre-arranged location somewhere in the Riverside San Bernardino area. Pat Broker would then call and tell Gail where to meet him so he could get the reports and pass along to her Hubbard's responses to the earlier reports. Usually they met in Los Angeles, often near LAX. With this complicated protocol, the hours of driving and the meeting itself, a single meeting with Pat chewed up most of the workday, and Gail found it difficult to spare the time to do it. In time, Gail became concerned with David's unbridled ambition and unruly behavior. She alerted the most senior technical person in Scientology, David Mayo, to interview David to find out what he was withholding from his colleagues and to clean him up. Scientology jargon that means to get him straight with the group again. David refused to submit to any sort of dealings with Mayo and stormed into Gail's office. She confronted him about his behavior, at which point, she later told Janet Reitman, David became furious and physically tackled her, sending her through an open door. At this, Gail became alarmed and arranged to meet with Broker to have David removed from his post, lest he jeopardize the tricky legal position Hubbard was in, not to mention the disruptions David was causing locally with his behavior. According to several accounts, Gail arranged to be driven to a phone booth to await a phone call from Pat about a meeting. When David found out where she had gone, he packed several of his associates into a van and raced to head Gail off. When the van arrived, one of the group used a tire iron to destroy the payphone, making any contact with Pat impossible. As Gail recounted it, David then nagged her to get into the van. There, he trashed her verbally, while the others mostly looked on in cowardly silence. Gail was removed as the head of the CMO and replaced by a more malleable messenger named John Nelson, someone who had worked with David when he headed up the area responsible for running Sea Org missions. Any perceived rivals were now out of the way. One final story from around that time illustrates that life within David's widening sphere of influence was becoming increasingly serious. Around Christmas time, the messengers got into the spirit of the season by drawing names from a hat and then becoming a secret Santa for the person whose name they had drawn. The idea was to send little joke gifts in the days before Christmas and then follow that up with a nicer present on Christmas. This is where a young woman named Tanya Burden comes in. She had been Dave's girlfriend for a time back in Clearwater. Tanya, in the meantime, had tired of the Sea Org and left. She was now involved in a lawsuit against the church. One of the senior messengers had a picture from Clearwater days showing Dave with his arm around Tanya. She convinced David's secret Santa to send this to him, along with one of his joke gifts. David opened the gift and was not amused. From what I was told, he exploded and ordered a full-scale investigation to determine who had sent him the photo. That pretty much put the kibosh on the Christmas cheer for the messengers that year. That was only the beginning. In later years, and increasingly during my time in the Sea Org, Christmas became almost an afterthought. Some years the organization was marked by the galleys preparing a nice meal, and that was basically it. While there was a tree and meager gifts were exchanged, any free time to enjoy the holidays with friends and family was next to zero. The prevailing mood was intense pressure to complete the work needed to prepare for an international briefing delivered to Scientologists around the world, summarizing the year's accomplishments. A friend from the base once told me that he was forced to stay up all Christmas Eve one year, as well as all Christmas Day, working on speeches for the upcoming event. It wasn't always that grim. In the early years of the Sea Org, Hubbard presided over parties aboard the Apollo, and when the Sea Org moved to land, these traditions continued, especially during the holidays. People had time to shop for presents and spend time with their families. There were parties and outings. People had some time to relax. But as the years passed, people had less chance to enjoy traditional holidays, until finally they passed almost unnoticed by Sea Org members, except silently. They definitely missed having a few bright moments in their otherwise dreary lives.